Australia's very own Bunyip, a creature of a myriad forms, countless theories, numerous legends and even more sightings, not even mentioning alternative names and versions. The Bunyip both exerted a significant effect on Aboriginal society and shaped the culture of the settlers to a comparable extent. A sprawling wilderness of legends, accounts and hoaxes, a labyrinthine subject so vast I barely know where to begin. Strap in folks, this is likely going to be a wide ride. A good portion of you likely know parts of the Bunyip rabbit hole, especially those living on the continent in question. Rest assured, whatever you heard is probably part of the legend and simultaneously contradictory of numerous other aspects. However, to have at least a common ground to start off of, I should describe the most common image of the beast, or at least the most commonly accepted modern depiction. The Bunyip is generally regarded as a large mammal with dark brown or black shaggy fur covering at least parts of it. The creature has a horse-like tail, flippers akin to those of a seal, and tusks. The neck, which is usually the sole bearer of the prominent coat in the form of a mane, is more often long than not, ranging from a swan-like posture to the image of a thick trunk. The head is typically reported to be canine, but the breed can vary widely. The settlers usually thought of it as a grazing herbivore, but the natives regarded it as a vicious man-eater. One thing everyone does agree on though is that bunyips can be found in freshwater habitats, including rivers, ponds, creeks, swamps and billabongs, the local flavor of oxbow lakes. So this is the rough image many have of the beast, but it is far from a definitive or universally accepted form. However, for the sake of my own sanity and your enjoyment, let's try and force some form of structure into the scrambled notes I prepared. In order to fully explore this maze of interconnected lore snippets, we should separate the native myths from the significantly fresher stories and tales spun by settlers. As far as we know, the Bunyip name originates from the Vemba, roughly meaning evil spirit in their language. The Bunyip, being a malevolent supernatural being, is relatively constant across the various oral traditions. The continental folklore is brimmed with stories of kidnapped people, haunted waterways, and curses caused by the monster. Bunyips are primarily nocturnal but can be roused from their slumber easily. They defend their lairs with blood-curdling bellows, devouring those who do not heed the warning. These lairs, called ganya by the natives, can be underwater dens or waterside caverns. Bunyip mothers rear their calves there, protecting them with unmatched ferocity. Would someone be foolish enough to steal one? The cow responds by sending a devastating flood after them. Even if they are intimidated by such a show of raw power and let the calf go, the mother may still decide to transform them and their entire tribe into black swans, as recounted by one of the Aboriginal legends. To circumvent such unfortunate events, natives are said to steer clear of habitats where the bunyip's roar is heard. However, this does not apply to all tribes, as you'll see later on. Now we know a bit about its nature and powers, but where does the bunyip come from? What are its origins? And why is it regarded as a spirit and not an animal? While not all native peoples may agree with this particular myth, the bunyip was apparently a man once. One of the wisest to have been created during the dream time, called Biami. However, in his hubris, Biami disobeyed the rainbow serpent and consumed his own totem animal. The deity banished him from his tribe, condemning him to unending exile. His rage led the man on a path of vengeance, hiding by waterways during the day and emerging at night to devour the sleeping. Some say he was no longer a man by this point, but an evil spirit. Apparently, young women of his former tribe tried to test his wickedness and approached Biami in spite of numerous warnings. They are now enslaved by Bunyip's sorcery, forced to lure fresh prey to their master using their beautiful voices as water spirits. Now, this is most definitely not a universal motive. Not only is this the only story I found with the siren-like ladies, but bunyips are a species, or at least a type of spirit by most other accounts, often having different genders and reproducing like any old animal. Still, a rather noteworthy myth, even if I unfortunately do not know which Aboriginal people it belongs to. To introduce a bit more nuance, the monster is not always pure bad. The Garangi sources attribute a sort of dual nature to the bunyip along the Murray River. While it is antagonistic to humans, fiercely protecting its habitat, it also aids tribesmen in upholding a natural balance. Bunyips, or Malyavongs as they are called there, are the perfect spooky monster to keep children from wandering off, and double as an overfishing deterrent. Bunyips apparently attack those who take more than their fair share of aquatic bounty, and all who decide to harm the beasts die a horrific death. Moral guidance that, ostensibly, is still adhered to. George French Angus, in his 1847 work titled Savage Life and Scenes in Australia and New Zealand, also investigated the Murray River and noted tales of the local Morundi people. Despite the geographic proximity, they had a different image of the bunyip, dreading the terrible beast. According to him, the locals had trouble describing the monstrosity, likening it to an enormous starfish. So we can add Eldritch Horror to our list of bunyip forms. Another, unnamed tribe tells of a story where a group of young hunters is captured by a bunyip and kept in its lair to be devoured when it hungers. An elder of the tribe dreams of this and tracks the prints of the monster to Tuganya, leaving clues and instructions for the rest of the tribe. This one has a happy ending, with the hunters and their savior rescued by digging through the ceiling of the den. Even the bunyip survives, albeit with damaged property. The reason this particular story is of interest is that it adds one more native description of the creature. Here, the bunyip is described as an animal 4 times the size of a large dog, covered in grey hair. It has a stumpy tail, 4-hoofed legs, large teeth, and boar tusks. Perhaps the most impressive part of the bunyip legends is the outline of a carcass preserved through generations. It is unknown when exactly the image of the dead animal was thrown into the soil in Victoria's Western District, as the Aboriginal myths only mention that it happened during the dreaming, for which there is no real timeline. A mysterious beast died during this legendary era, and spears were stuck into the ground around it. Later on, the turf between the marking implements was removed, creating this image. Well, the original one was likely more accurate, as the unknown amount of time that has passed between this copy and the event in question likely had an effect on the result, since the lines were constantly redrawn to preserve it. This depiction was supposedly around 9 meters long. Was, as it is unfortunately no longer there. Its existence was noted by the settlers during the 1840s, at which point it was still vividly etched into the ground, but it has since faded. An invaluable piece of the past lost forever. This drawing was all the more significant since most tribes did not draw the bunyip at all. It was believed that depictions of the beast could invoke its presence, and they feared the malevolent spirit immensely. Alas, this is the only, at least partially authentic image we have, other than a handful of much more contemporary drawings. Now this is the section where I am going to transition to the settlers' side of things. Most of our information was preserved through their writings, but it cannot be surgically separated from Aboriginal accounts, as they often were the primary source or were asked to provide their input for various sightings or material evidence. The very first report that was later attributed to the bunyip was a sound. In 1801, the crew of the Géographie, a French ship, heard a roar that was louder than a bull's bellow by the small river. Naturally, being Frenchmen, they immediately fled the scene, making the whole ordeal rather lacking in detail. The sound almost definitely belonged to a brown bittern, but we'll discuss what animals the bunyip was likely based on a bit later. For some reason, Hamilton Hume's alleged 1818 or 1821 discovery of large bones is purported as the second report linked to the bunyip. However, not only were the bones never recovered, despite the money offered by the Philosophical Society of Australasia, he never claimed it to be a bunyip, but rather described it as some sort of manatee or hippopotamus. You may find it hypocritical that I also included it here, but my main goal was to refute this commonly accepted link. That being said, I am not going to recount all sightings, as the majority of them provide little additional information. If you wish to read of each spotting, I have found a handy little website that lists a good portion of them up to the 1900s in a mostly readable format. Unfortunately, the original version no longer exists, as it was likely made in the distant, foggy past of the early 2000s, and only a 2011 capture was archived, with adverts blocking some of the valuable info. Still, I link it in the description as I found it to be the most complete list. The next account of significance is an article in the Geelong Advertiser, a daily newspaper. On June the 2nd, 1845, the word Bunyip was used first in written form, preserving a rather unique account with a whole new appearance for the beast. The story started out as a selection of fossils found near Geelong, but escalated significantly when the remains were shown to a native. The Aboriginal man identified it as a bunyip, producing a drawing to show the monster in its alive state too. It is one of the few versions that sports an emu head with a long beak. The bill itself is literally described as at the extremity of which is a transverse projection on each side, which either means a T-shape or two horns. Regardless, the two tips or horns were serrated, like the bone of a stingray, by which they likely mean the stinger itself. The body is that of an alligator, with particularly thick and strong hind legs and somewhat thinner but much longer front limbs. Its claws are of an impressive length, and it kills by hugging its prey. When in water, the bunyip swims like a frog, but on land it walks on its hind legs. An unlikely creature, to be sure, but the bunyip expert recounted a woman eaten by one, and introduced a certain Mr. Mamboran, who had huge claw marks on his chest, courtesy of the monster. Naturally, authenticity is never guaranteed with these sorts of news, but it is not an unlikely scenario. The bunyip is a beast of a myriad forms, as we've established, and Aboriginal people misidentifying most large fossils or unusual bones as belonging to them was a common occurrence. Let's see another example, one from a year later. In 1846, an odd skull was found on the banks of the Murrumbidgee River in New South Wales. The area was already known for bunyip calls, so it was only logical this one would be a definitive proof, right? The settler who found it even showed it to natives, who all identified it as the monster in question. The skull was even put on display in the Australian Museum, with long rows of visitors showing up to see it, sharing their own stories of this creature. Apparently, people also call it Kaimpretai, one name I have not seen elsewhere, as well as Cottonbro, which does show up a couple times. However, it was only on display for 2 days. Why, you'd ask? Could there be some sort of conspiracy to hide this irrefutable evidence? Well, several experts identified the beast to be a deformed calf or false skull. That was unfortunate, but it's probably an isolated case, right? Well, these two events in conjunction marked the beginning of a bit of a bunyip fever, with reports coming in left and right. While some of these were legitimate accounts, there is a good reason the word bunyip came to be a synonym for hoax. One of the most eloquent examples for this is George Hubler's 1847 spotting. He described a rather typical long-necked, flipper-tusked bunyip, going the whole 9 yards in describing the most commonly accepted version. He even had foot, or rather flipper print evidence. However, these tracks were suspiciously broad and square for a beast of Hubler's description. They looked almost like marks left by outstretched human hands pressed into the mud. While pranks and hoaxes were commonplace, it is rather important to note that not all accounts were made up. So let's recount the most notable ones that were likely based on real events. From the 1850s to as late as the 1930s, bulldog-headed creatures were seen around the continent, often in Tasmania. They were about a meter long, covered in shaggy fur, usually splashing the water with their fins. The hindquarters were never described to my knowledge, but their front flippers resembled bat wings. While this seems to resemble the general image of a seal, the bulldog head makes identification tricky. Additionally, sightings have seemingly stopped since 1932, so whatever they were, they have either disappeared, or people successfully identify them nowadays as known animals. Another significant source of bunyip information comes from William Buckley's biography. The book was published in 1852, but it recounts the 1803-1835 period, which the escaped convicts spent with natives in the Victoria area. The man saw the monster multiple times from the back, and even took a shot at killing one with a spear. Since he never had the chance to fully observe the animal, his description only mentions grey feather covering a creature the size of a full-grown calf. While he reported the bunyip to be rather common, especially in the Barwon River, None of the Aboriginal people he spoke with knew what the head or tail might look like. However, he did note that he was told a native woman was killed by one, and that the monster was believed to have supernatural powers. Not much to go on, but definitely reinforces that few know what the Bunyip actually is. The one last account of significant importance would be the 1857 incident of Edwin Stockeller. The short saga consists of 2 articles and a diorama painting. While the diorama has been lost to time, the 2 pieces published in newspapers have been archived and are still accessible. I've linked both because they are an interesting read, especially one after the other. As the story goes, Mr. Stockeller encountered mysterious animals while traveling on the Goulburn River and decided to sketch the curious scene. According to the various heralds and other news sources, based on the drawings, the Bunyip is a large freshwater seal having 2 small podals or fins attached to the shoulders, a long swan-like neck, a head like a dog, and a curious back hanging under the jaw, resembling the pouch of the pelican. The animal is covered with hair like the platypus, and the color is a glossy black. Interesting beasts, to be sure, and the man saw no less than 6 of the buggers. Unfortunately, he was sitting in a dingy boat, carrying a rifle with a single barrel, and he dared not approach the large creatures as a result. Now, much of this account turned out to be false, but there was at least one fully accurate part of it. Mr. Stockeller showed his sketch to natives, who informed him that what he drew was the Bunyip's brother, signaling a great likeness between the 2 beings. We know that most of the article was fabrication or misinformation because the naturalist issued a response a few months later, targeted at the editor of the Bendigo Advertiser, the original source of the news. In it he claimed that his statements were misinterpreted and misquoted. He never called the creature a bunyip, and neither did it have a swan's neck. He was unfortunately rather brief, as he was in preparation of painting a massive diorama that would replicate the scene. As I've already said, it is not known whether the diorama still exists or not, as it has disappeared since, along with the tidbit that would be most important to us. Truly a shame, as it took the man 4 years, the final version being composed of 70 individual images. However, since it did at one time exist and a few records of it remain, it seems the mysterious animals were seals. Speaking of seals, it is high time we address what a bunyip actually is. With all these accounts, reports and legends left and right, it must be a real thing, right? Well, it is, but all evidence points to the fact that it is not an animal unknown to science. It seems to be a variety of unusual animals, remains, or sounds attributed to the same being. Based on the accounts I listed, and many of the less significant ones, natives do not have a single image of the bunyip, each having their own version, or having no idea what it even looks like in some cases. To them, the bunyip is more than an animal, it is part of their culture, but it has evolved in myriad different ways through retellings, to a point where it seems to simply mean a terrible water monster of any kind. Aboriginal people have been ready to call anything they could not recognize a bunyip, whether it was genuine belief, confusion, or nothing but a practical joke is unknown, but it was likely a mix of all 3. There's a reason we have the drop bear after all. The primary animal mistaken for the mythical monster seems to be the seal, or other multiple seal species. You'd be forgiven to be surprised by such a claim, as almost all seals are marine creatures. However, they are known to swim inland, following tributaries either out of curiosity or seeking alternative food sources. Leopard seals, sea lions and elephant seals seem to be prime candidates for such misidentifications. They are all rather sizable, have vicious fangs, relatively long necks, especially in the case of these chunguses, heads resembling dogs or, well, monsters, and like to make a lot of noise. They are surely an odd sight, especially for tribes unfamiliar with the sea. One thing that might be amiss though is the fur, but we have fur seals for that too. More modest in size, but sporting much more noticeable coats. In addition to seals, dugongs may also account for a couple sightings, particularly those that mention a puppy-headed or bulldog-faced monster. That being said, take this possibility with a pinch of salt, as these docile mammals are not known to have ever entered fresh water, and therefore do not share a habitat with bunyip legends, although there are a couple of brand bunyipoid creatures that we'll discuss a bit later. As the second real bunyip, we have the brown bittern, the bird I've already mentioned. It's even occasionally called a bunyip bird, just listen to its voice. The bush stone curlew also has a funky voice resembling screams. So that is one more option. While we are on the topic of birds, some natives describe the head as that of an owl. There was no good way to mention this earlier, so I put it here despite breaking the flow of the paragraph because I'm a professional. Anyway, I'm mentioning it now because the barking owl is another avian candidate. It has an unusual song, lives near waterways, and happens to share similarity with one bunyip type as well. Hard to deny this link. In terms of remains, I spoke of the deformed skull and 2 instances of fossil finds. However, there were numerous similar bones unearthed or found in caves, some of which were identified by natives to be bunyips. Such scattered skeletons were likely also found by Aboriginal people, fueling their legends, but there's even more to it. Numerous large marsupials that have since gone extinct may have lived on in the tales of the tribes, surviving generations but being distorted by countless retellings. Promising candidates for these bygone beasts include the diprotodon, which was essentially a huge wombat with massive fangs and claws that fancied plants a lot more than human flesh. Some petrographs of it still remain, or at least we assume that's a diprotodon. While this genesis brought up most often as the basis for the bunyip, there are a few others that also fit the bill to varying degrees. These are the Zygomaterus, Nototherium, or Palorchestes genera. Additionally, since some accounts mention emu heads, the Dromornithidae family is also theorized to have a possible link to the monster down under. A long shot, since those accounts usually also mention forelimbs, and these beaks are not exactly comparable. Maybe Genionis newtoni is not that far off, but it was unlikely to be a predator. Still, there could be something to them. One last honorable mention goes to the so-called swagmen of the 1890s to 1930s period. Australian fugitives hiding from the law, or victims of circumstance who found themselves homeless, carrying their large backpacks or rucksacks, in other words, their swag. Many of them sought refuge in the wilderness, usually swamps and billabongs, which just so happened to be bunyip homes. According to a couple accounts, swagmen often plunged into the water when they heard people coming, fearing the authority. When they emerged, covered in plant matter and mud, they might have frightened a couple of people, especially if they used bunyip tails to their advantage and added some odd sounds of their own making. This is quite an exhaustive list, one that leads most to the conclusion that the bunyip is not an unknown monster, but a myth mixed with real experiences. As is par for the course, a subset of cryptozoologists still believes that bunyips are surviving prehistoric megafauna or seals, perhaps walruses, adapted to freshwater environments. The giant marsupials we know of were not aquatic, and only a tiny segment of contemporary pouch animals pursue a lifestyle linked to such habitats. Water opossums, the species that was featured prominently in the last video. A bit weird they came up twice in a row. Anyhow, the other idea of walruses and seals isn't much of a winner either. Walruses are solely found in the northern hemisphere, so any of them ending up in a billabong is a stench so bloody huge it gave me an aneurysm. Seals are much better candidates, but there's no need to shoehorn in a new species to explain bunyips. Seals tend to end up in tributaries. That's more than enough evidence. However, the fact that something is not impossible is usually reason enough for some to go on a wild goose chase. On the other hand, the general public has already accepted the bunyip to not be a single real creature. Beside the name itself being used interchangeably with bogeyman or hoax, the bunyip's myriad forms have been embraced as part of its identity. This is perhaps shown best by a 1994 STEM series issued by the Australian Postal Service. These 4 curious little pieces were commissioned from 4 different artists, putting emphasis on the fact that everyone has their own ideas about the beast. The Bunyip encompasses a large selection of distinct creatures, all mixed into sprawling legend. As such, it is difficult to discern what is a Bunyip and what isn't. What really complicates things is a detail I've intentionally been light on. Bunyip is not the only name for this, or rather these creatures. I've already mentioned Ketempai and Malivonk, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Other notable names are the Tuntaba and Viva, but as we go further, the creatures behind some of these names also stray further and further from the collective Bunyip mythos. Take for example the Tasmanian Universal Eye, which is supposedly a many-thing snake, but is still referred to as a Bunyip. There's also the Majbank, which is a half-man, half-fish entity with reeds for hair, residing in Lake Alexandrina. His booming voice is also believed to cause rheumatism, one of the more outlandish descriptions given by Reverend George Taplin, stretching the boundaries quite a bit, likely intentionally. There's also the Tantapan, a marine variant. It was spotted in Port Phillip sometime during the 1800s. The mix of features rings familiar, as it was described as an emu-headed, long-necked aquatic creature. It had the signature mane and flippers, as well as a taste for human flesh. That being said, it apparently eats mostly crayfish and lays exactly 2 eggs. While not originally called a Bunyip, it has since been viewed as a variant, and it is hard to deny the similarities. All in all, the Bunyip has quite a depth, composed of both age-old legends and a plethora of brief encounters. It is only right I try to add my own version to the tale. That's right, it's speculative evolution time again. However, to do that we have to establish which form we are going to go by. It is probably fair if we go for the most common features. A long neck, flippers, fur, tusks, and let's go with the dog-like head as opposed to the emu one. Now, it is also important to note that the Bunyip was capable of walking the land in most legends too, so some level of terrestrial traversal is desired. If you are sitting there, slightly disappointed that I'm just going to make a generic seal based on this information, let me reassure you that I have something a bit more unique in mind. While seals do occasionally have temporary or even long-term colonies deciding to hang around in freshwater habitats after swimming up from the sea, the Baikal seal is the only species that is specifically not a marine pinniped. So in Australia, a land where no pond is comparable to Lake Baikal in size, what could convince a highly mobile aquatic animal to focus solely on habitats with generally less potential instead of an opportunistic lifestyle? Between fish in the ocean and penguins on the Antarctic, there are numerous habitats that offer more stable food sources for sizable aquatic predators than what rivers do. Additionally, as a seal, you don't really have to choose either. You can traverse as you please, and change your hunting grounds if they prove less favorable or more dangerous after a while. On the other hand, just adding another seal that occasionally visits the waterways of Australia would not do justice to the Bunyip legends either. There is a distinct possibility we could follow, one that has not occurred to my knowledge, but may very well happen under unique circumstances. As you all know, terrestrial creatures evolved from aquatic animals, and some, like seals, return to the sea due to evolutionary pressure or to fill available niches. Well, if the transition happened once, it is only logical it could happen again. What I mean is an ancient seal population returning to land in some capacity. Now, it is true that running such a developmental full circle is not only unprecedented to my knowledge, but also rather unlikely. Essentially, we not only need an early pinniped species to limit themselves to coastal and freshwater habitats, but to also gain tangible benefit from a semi-terrestrial lifestyle. In order to justify all of this, we have to introduce some rather significant changes to the ecology of ancient Australia. We should start by going back to the early Miocene. Inalearctos species have been around by this time and had time to disperse. These mammals are regarded as the ancestors to modern seals, and very likely closely resembled them. That being said, they were not as streamlined at this time yet. Their hind feet were a lot more distinct than the fin-like limbs of today's contemporary species. While no fossil evidence of such creatures has been recovered from Australia yet, I'd say a couple million years are more than enough for them to have spread there. Their descendants, at the very least, did, so it is a likely prospect. As we see with modern seals, it is not out of the question that inhalearctos species would pop in to see what's up with the continent's waterways. Now, here comes a bit of shoehorning. Having a mostly aquatic mammalian predator compete with the carnivores of the epoch, quinquenas and other less terrestrial crocodiles would be their main opponents. Animals that have been there for a long time and are quite good at what they do, unlikely to be pushed out by an early seal that could just go elsewhere instead of pushing claw and teeth against a formidable competition. Yeah, not a realistic proposition. We essentially have to take a liberty and say that for one reason or another, on this alternative Earth, quinquenas were far less prominent or even absent when a few inhalearctos populations reached inland waters. The reason I specifically chose quinquenas is twofold. First off, we do not have to kill all other crocodiles, as the freshwater habitats more than likely had enough food to make some of the seals consider to stay short term. Secondly, we need a reason to make them stay long term. The way to do it is by offering them abundant waterside prey. A carnivore more fit to pursue than lie in ambush fits right in, partially because we just got rid of the original one, but that's beside the point. So to sum it up nicely, some inhalearctos groups appear down under. They wander about, catch the prey they can, and when they are faced with competition, the ocean is not the place they go back to. Instead, they use the advantage granted to them via a better metabolic system and being endothermic, and catch prey the crocodiles would not bother to or would not be capable of. As they spend more and more time on land again, they develop limbs more fit for a semi-aquatic lifestyle, essentially undoing some of their prior evolution. However, Australia at the time is not home only to smaller animals. Megafauna is still quite numerous. Sure, there are pretty well-adapted predators hunting them out there, like the Thylacoleo or the Megalania, but the opportunity to catch a few of more modest size that wish to satiate their thirst is hard to overlook. In such a scenario, growing larger is not just a boon granted by the combination of aquatic and waterside delicacies, but a chance to tap into more resources. As these proto-bunyips increase in size and expand their diet, competition in their own ranks grows. The duels of males become even more vicious, tearing at each other to gain mating rights. Doubling as tools for hunting and weapons for gentlemanly bouts, their canines become more prominent, resembling forward protruding tusks. These duels are not unlike the fights between elephant seals, with the two opponents comparing their size and biting at each other's necks. It is a bit less vicious, as bunyips have far more potent weapons, and each fight ending in death is not a desirable outcome, but similar factors drive selection nonetheless. A long neck provides a taller stature, which alone can be enough to win without combat, as can large tusks. Time flies, especially if we introduce such evolutionary changes, as by the time our bunyips have assumed their current form, humans arrive to Australia. Soon after, megafauna disappear, one after the other. A significant source of nutrition dries up, and while they are more than equipped to effectively compete for what remains, they are in danger nonetheless. However, as fortunate as it might be, a combination of factors ensures their survival. Humans are formidable hunters and dangerous opponents, but are heavily influenced by their culture. The vicious bunyips, molded by the razor's edge competition for food during the times before men, do not hesitate to feast on the new arrivals when they get a chance. They soon learn that the weapon-wielding beings are not very effective at fighting in water, offering them sanctuary and a place to strike from. Unfortunately, they are too much of a hassle to offer a reliable source of food, but bunyips are already used to being rather opportunistic. Tales of the terrors under the surface begin to spread, giving giving them a larger-than-life reputation, dissuading any would-be hunters. While the transformation of their habitats and the change in available prey does reduce their numbers significantly, bunyips persevere, surviving as the largest carnivorous mammals of the continent. There you have it, the most common features accounted for. Since they are still technically pinnipeds, an intimidating roar is par for the course. Now, the remaining forms would naturally be a result of the spawning myths again, mixing in other odd sounds and hearsay into accounts about the actual beast. Didn't think I'd finish this episode without explaining some characteristics as embellishments, did you? Quite a unique little beast, all things considered, and the fruit of a rather extensive episode, by Monsters Dissected standards at the very least. I hope you liked the new addition to the existing menagerie and enjoyed the creation process too. If you did, I suggest checking out my Discord server, which is linked in the description, as such speculation is a significant part of what we do there. I'm also thinking about making a Patreon, which may or may not be ready at the time of publishing, so I guess if you have some money you really need to get rid of, I may have a safe disposal site ready for you. I'll probably have more information on that at a later date though. Regardless, hope to see you next time as well. Bye!